For those of you I haven't met, my name is Gad Hume, and I'm one of the organizers of the seminar, along with Steve Cushion and Kate Quinn. And it's a great pleasure this evening to welcome, this evening here at least, to welcome Brooke Newman to the seminar. Brooke just told us that she's been promoted to full professor at Virginia Commonwealth University, which is very, very good news, and I think overdue. Um, it's interesting because she is an award-winning historian for her first book, A Dark Inheritance, which I can personally recommend, and which I thought would do it in and of itself, as I just mentioned to her. But in any case, we are celebrating her new book, which you can see on the screen, I hope, The Crown's Silence. And we will proceed in the usual way. Brooke will speak for somewhere around 30 minutes, and then we will open the floor for discussion. So I hope you will be saving up your questions. And I think by now most of you know the way to get attention either in the chat or by raising your hand. So electronically. So I will pass this over to Brooke.
Great, thank you. And thanks so much for inviting me to be here. I think this is such a great seminar. And I love that they're recorded so you can catch up if you miss any of them. So today, this evening, this morning, depending on where you are, I'll be providing a brief overview of my new book, The Crown's Silence. And this will definitely be a kind of a whirlwind tour. This book covers multiple centuries, and I'll just be trying to squeeze a ton of stuff into this talk. But really, overall, the book argues that the British monarchy was not a distant observer of the transatlantic slave trade or colonial slavery. It was an investor, an enforcer, and a beneficiary. The book traces that involvement across several centuries, and it asks why the institution that profited the most has said the least. Oops. There we go. First, I'd like to begin with relatively recent context. In April 2023, in response to The Guardian's Cost of the Crown series, Buckingham Palace announced that King Charles supported research into the monarchy's historical links to slavery. At the time, there was a huge backlash to this announcement in the conservative UK media. He was attacked for allegedly going, quote, woke. But the king neither acknowledged this history or apologize for anything. And I think that is a really key point here. More than anything, this was a PR move on behalf of the palace. At the time, though, the global coverage of this announcement treated it as though the king was opening unprecedented access to royal records. But historians, as most of us here know, have long had that access to those records. The deeper problem is methodological. Uncovering the monarchy's ties to slavery depends not on a single archive and definitely not on a sort of bespoke, heavily curated royal archive. It requires tracing networks of power and profit across the wider imperial record. That is what this book does, and it does so both through new research, but also through synthesizing, decades of really important historical scholarship on the transatlantic slave trade and the expansion of slavery in the Atlantic world. As historians have shown, many historians, the archives of slavery were deliberately designed to obscure, to reduce human beings to commodities in ledgers, cargo manifests, and balance sheets. Even seemingly benign images like this 18th century Jamaican pastoral scene sanitized plantation life, and deliberately so, masking the brutalities of slavery just beyond the frame. Yet a vast paper trail, royal charters and proclamations, state papers, company records, custom receipts, correspondence, West Indian lobby meeting minutes, abolitionist papers, and so much more, reveals a long history of complicity. Much of this archival evidence, originally produced to legitimize and sanitize and to track colonial commodification and violence, now serves as a record of the monarchy's direct role in empire building and racial exploitation. My book is divided into 4 parts. Part 1 delves into the Tudor origins of England's involvement in the transatlantic slave trade. So we'll spend a few minutes on that aspect of the book briefly. To understand why Elizabeth I supported English slaving ventures, it's essential to situate her policies within the geopolitical rivalry, economic constraints, and religious ideology of the Tudor era. By the late 15th century, Spain and Portugal had established a near monopoly over Atlantic exploration and overseas empire. Their claims, on paper at least, were formalized by papal decrees, which fused religious expansion with imperial extraction. At the time, England lacked the fiscal infrastructure and the naval capacity to directly challenge Iberian dominance. But by the mid 16th century, English merchants had begun pursuing indirect strategies to penetrate Iberian controlled Atlantic markets. Under the Protestant Queen Elizabeth I, opportunistic attempts to break Iberian commercial monopolies in the Atlantic accelerated. Elizabeth herself promoted multiple so-called Guinea ventures, loaning vessels from her navy, which was quite modest, to merchant syndicates in exchange for a share of the profits to benefit her cash-strapped government. So these were exploratory groups, and she was investing in them in the sense of providing typically vessels, sometimes supplies and men in exchange for a cut of any potential proceeds. These early ventures focused primarily on commodities that were already in demand in Europe, things like ivory, dye woods used for dyeing textiles, pepper, gold, and animal hides. That changed after 1563, when Plymouth merchant John Hawkins completed his first transatlantic slaving voyage. He had seized around 300 Africans in Sierra Leone, quote, partly by the sword and partly by other means, end quote, as he later claimed, before selling those who survived to Spanish colonists in Hispaniola. Queen Elizabeth saw the opportunity immediately. In 1564 and then again in 1567, she sponsored Hawkins' slaving voyages by lending him royal warships, including the 700-ton Jesus of Lubeck and the 300-ton Minion. The second voyage launched by Hawkins, which was quite successful, yielded around 66,000 pounds, around a 60% return for Hawkins and his sponsors, including the Queen. The third voyage sponsored by Hawkins was the largest English slaving venture of this century, totaling 6 ships, 2 of which were provided by the Queen, and 408 men. But this voyage ended in disaster when the Spanish fleet attacked Hawkins and his ships at Veracruz, destroying half of the fleet and 3/4 of the crew who lost their lives. Spain later rejected Hawkins' demands for 28,000 pounds in compensation, a claim that the Queen supported on Hawkins' behalf. In this claim, there was a reference to 9,000 pounds worth of people, 57 enslaved Africans, that Hawkins described as being of, quote, the best stature. So this was absolutely rejected by Spain, and also this was a sign of increasing Anglo-Spanish tensions, and also a moment when the English had seen the profit that could be made from slavering, but also the danger of essentially trying to wrangle with the Spanish in Spanish America. At the time, Hawkins, though, was celebrated, and he was granted a coat of arms featuring a nude and bound African. I'm going to move now into the Stuart era of expansion and kind of skip over a little bit of the details from Elizabeth and what happens up to the reign of James, but it is in the book. The early Stuart period brought growing English commercial engagement with West Africa. In 1618, King James I granted a monopoly over that trade to the Guinea Company, which by 1624 had erected a fort on the Gold Coast in what is now modern-day Ghana. The company dealt primarily in redwood for dye, ivory, and also gold, and it also nearly bankrupted itself, hunting fruitlessly for gold mines. Charles I later renewed the company's charter in 1631, and by then the context had shifted. Now there were English colonists in North America and the Caribbean, and they were demanding laborers. Planters had discovered that enslaved Africans could be purchased cheaply and forced into permanent hereditary bondage. The Guinea Company moved to enter the transatlantic slave trade in the 1630s and definitely more so in the 40s, but it struggled against Dutch and independent competition. And this is a problem that the Stuarts would soon move to resolve. However, in the meantime, we've got a non-royal playing an absolutely critical role in this story, and that is Cromwell. During the Commonwealth era, Oliver Cromwell worked with Parliament to radically expand the Navy, which is critical to the story, to pass the Navigation Acts, which helps funnel more revenue back to the English state, and also eventually seizing Jamaica as a consolation prize for the failure of the Western design. Jamaica would end up becoming an absolutely important piece of the British Atlantic Empire, especially in the 18th century. What Cromwell did in the 1650s was lay the imperial infrastructure that the Stuarts would inherit and immediately exploit. The restoration of the Stuart monarchy in 1660 marked a decisive shift. Royal patronage moved beyond sporadic interest to direct financial and institutional investment in slaving. Charles II and his younger brother James, Duke of York, moved aggressively into the transatlantic slave trade, granting a monopoly charter to the royal adventurers, which the king did, really quickly after he came back to the throne. And within a few years, they had begun prioritizing the trafficking of Africans. They were already interested in the beginning, but by 1663, this was the major pivot towards transatlantic slaving. The king, his wife, their cousin, James, all subscribed large sums in this company. The king, however, had a hard time actually following up on his subscription due to a lack of liquid capital. So he strengthened the venture materially by loaning Royal Navy vessels to the company for trade, but also and critically for convoy protection, which was very important to protecting the transatlantic slaving vessels. The Royal Adventurers operated along the Gold Coast and transported thousands of enslaved people to Barbados and Jamaica in the 1660s. But it ultimately foundered on a lack of liquid capital, primarily because most of the purchases that were being made on credit, extended to planters who then were not actually paying the company, as well as the disruptions of the Second Anglo-Dutch War. In 1672, Charles II granted a new charter to the reconstituted Royal African Company. The king deployed distinctly royal tools that flowed from prerogative authority, such as monopoly charters, royal proclamations, and his control over the navy to facilitate and to defend the Royal African Company's slaving ventures. James, Duke of York, was not only the governor of the company and its largest shareholder, he was also Lord High Admiral. In consultation with the king, he controlled the deployment of royal naval vessels, which he used to enforce the company's monopoly and to crush independent competition. This, at the time, was deeply unpopular, and the company's monopoly was seen as a detriment to the mercantile community and to many of the commercial interests of people in England. Charles II and James II both issued proclamations restricting West African trade exclusively to the company, and they sent letters to colonial governors to prosecute interlopers and to ensure that any of these ships that were taken as prizes that the proceeds would revert back to both the Lord High Admiral and also to the king, that they would get their share. Stuart support extended beyond commerce and also to the legal architecture of slavery itself and to the material culture of slavery. Colonial slave codes defining enslaved Africans as property to be bought, sold, mortgaged, seized for debt, and inherited carried the crown's endorsement. That endorsement was also inscribed in currency. Coins struck from Royal African Company gold and silver bore the company's elephant emblem, circulating the symbols of royal-backed slaving across Britain for decades and into much later reigns in the 18th century. Between 1672 and the early 1720s, the Royal African Company transported more than 150,000 enslaved Africans across the Atlantic. As William Pettigrew notes, they transported more than any other single company in the history of this era. The returns flowed directly to the monarchy at every level, both personally in the form of, for example, dividends and gifts of gold, including to James, the largest shareholder and governor, whose initials DY were also literally branded into the bodies of hundreds of enslaved people who were working at Royal African Company coastal factories. And these workers were known as, quote, castle slaves. And I can talk about this more during Q&A if you're interested. Institutionally, though, the scale of revenue was far greater. Customs duties on colonial staples produced by enslaved labor flowed into the royal treasury. By the late 1680s, plantation goods, especially sugar and tobacco, comprised a third share of the crown's ordinary income. So this was, foundational income. This was not peripheral. This was critical. Royal investment in slaving also shaped elite culture at home. Enslaved children appeared at court and were featured routinely in aristocratic portraiture. Charles II's mistresses, and on your screen you're just seeing a few of the examples here, commissioned portraits featuring Black pages, most of whom were children, in silver and pearl collars, sort of identifying them as enslaved figures. They were status symbols that worked to normalize racial servitude while also advertising their owners' proximity to the king and to imperial commerce. Royal ties to the Atlantic slave empire survived the Glorious Revolution. Though James II was deposed for his Catholicisms and absolutist tendencies, the Royal African Company secured new backing under William III and Mary II, and slavery remained highly visible at court. In 2023, I visited Kensington Palace with David Kahn, a Guardian journalist, and we were really surprised to see this bust of an enslaved man commissioned by William III on display in the Queen's Gallery at Kensington Palace. And what surprised us was not that it was on display, it was that it was cataloged and presented as among the Mary II's home comforts and beautiful treasures. So we thought this was really striking the wrong note. It also had a plaque that identified this figure as a favorite servant rather than an enslaved man, despite the obvious collar around his neck and the archival description of this bust, which for hundreds of years was on display in Hampton Court Palace and then also in Kensington Palace. And many visitors commented upon the fact that this was clearly an enslaved man based on the collar as well. The enslaved figure as a collectible, an aesthetic object conveying royal power and luxury, endured beyond any single monarch. And I think that's a really important point to keep in mind. In 1698, Parliament ended the Royal African Company's monopoly, opening the slave trade to independent merchants. The result was a dramatic surge in slaving activity. More vessels and more enslaved people were delivered to Jamaica, Barbados, the Leeward Islands, and particularly the Chesapeake, which had been underserved, particularly as far as the planters were concerned, under the Royal African Company in the 17th century. This led to greater agricultural production and rising customs revenue flowing to the crown and ultimately also flowing to the British state. In 1713, Queen Anne secured the Asiento Contract, granting Britain the right to deliver 4,800 enslaved Africans annually to Spanish America for 30 years. She transferred the contract to the South Sea Company, which offered holders of government debt a stake in the slave trade to Spanish America and in this company. Anne invested personally in the South Sea Company, and before she died, she provided royal warships to initiate this contract. But she died before anything could really get started. Her successors, though, George I and George II, followed suit. Both invested in the South Sea Company and both served as honorary governors in this company. The South Sea Company, despite what many people think, was not just a Ponzi scheme. It's known mostly for the bubble, but it's really important to emphasize that this company successfully transported around 43,000 Africans in total from the Bight of Benin, the Gold Coast, the West Central Africa, the Windward Coast, Senegambia, and East Africa, many of whom were branded with the company's logo, which was intertwined with royal insignia. So there is still investment being made by the monarchs directly enslaving after the Glorious Revolution into the 18th century. And the monarchs are profiting not only from their own Atlantic empire, which is increasingly fueled by enslaved labor and slaving, but also through investment in slavery in Spanish America. By the mid-18th century, Britain had built a vast Atlantic slave empire. Slavery underwrote entire economic sectors: shipping, sugar refining, marine insurance, retail, enriching Liverpool, Bristol, London, and more. The Caribbean colonies were Britain's wealthiest Atlantic possessions, where the vast majority of the population was enslaved and where many of those people were actually arriving on slaving vessels, especially in places like Jamaica with an incredibly high mortality rate. This empire built on coerced labor was inherently vulnerable, and this is something that George III would later discover. When George III inherited this Atlantic slave empire in 1760, he also inherited the racial ideology sustaining it. Whatever private reservations he may have held based on some of his surviving notes in the Royal Archives, where he expresses some doubt about moral justifications for slavery when he's a teenage Prince of Wales, his priorities as king were clear: to defend the empire and to accept slavery as a necessary evil, and even more so, to utilize enslaved people to benefit both Britain and also British imperial expansion. British victories in the Seven Years' War had added new territories in North America, the Caribbean, and well beyond, deepening the demand for enslaved labor. The Crown also purchased enslaved people outright. They were designated so-called King's Negroes, or the King's Slaves, and they were used to labor at Royal Navy bases in places like Jamaica and Antigua, and also to fight in the King's name. That reliance on enslaved military labor culminated in the 1790s in the formal creation of the Black West India regiments. So one of the points that the book makes is that although the constitutional position of the monarchy has changed in the 18th century, and particularly by the reign of George III, he is still, through his control of the military, benefiting from enslaved people and viewing them in some ways almost like chess pieces to be manipulated on the board in order to benefit his empire. However, around the same time that this is occurring in the late 18th century, the abolitionist movement has, really taken flight in London and other locations. Abolitionists had begun to challenge Britain's transatlantic slave trade. And then some people, particularly Black abolitionists like Ottobah Kugano, took this even further. And he's a really fascinating person. I talk about him in my book. He lived for a period only 2 blocks from Carlton House, the Prince of Wales' London residence. He lived with some artists and he interacted with royalty, with aristocracy, with members of parliament, with artists, and he tried to use that position to benefit the abolitionist cause. He sent copies of his radical anti-slavery book, Thoughts and Sentiments, to both George III and the Prince of Wales with personalized notes, urging both of these men to think about their legacy and to think about essentially the fact, especially the king was the head of the church. How could he support something that was clearly immoral and wicked and potentially could result in the punishment of the British people for engaging in such, as he calls, a evil and wicked traffic? But he was met with silence from both of them. And it is really fascinating that this book is still held by the Royal Collection today. That was sent to the Prince of Wales. While basically you've got the abolitionists on the one side appealing to the monarchs and members of the royal family, you also have the Duke of Clarence, George III's third son and the future King William IV, allying openly and very vocally with the West Indian lobby. He defended the slave trade in the House of Lords. He also defended slavery as an institution itself, and his speeches were widely printed and circulated. He also was the only member of the royal family to actually step foot in colonial slave societies and to return to Britain, because he was in the Royal Navy, and say essentially that he had special insight into slavery because he was an eyewitness. And so he used his alleged special insight not to benefit enslaved people, but to benefit the pro-slavery lobby. As a result, the lobby rewarded him with lavish hospitality and a gold Jamaica service funded by the Jamaica Assembly, which is still held by the Royal Collection, and you're not going to see it on display typically. He was also given jewels, and Liverpool merchants named slaving vessels in his honor. And these you can track actually in the Slave Voyages database online. Royal opposition, both public in the form of the Duke of Clarence and also behind the scenes, helped to stall abolition legislation for nearly 2 decades. When Britain's slave trade was abolished in 1807, the lives of around 700,000 enslaved people who were actually living and laboring in the Caribbean changed very little. Consequently, they took matters into their own hands, staging rebellions in Barbados in 1816, in Demerara in 1823, and then in Jamaica in 1831 to 32, the Christmas Rebellion. The message of enslaved people was clear. They considered themselves loyal subjects of the crown, and they were willing to die for their freedom. And I think this is a really critical turning point in this story. It is not, we're not looking at essentially institutions that are the vanguard here. We are looking at grassroots activism on behalf of abolitionist groups, many of whom were former enslaved men and women, as well as enslaved people themselves, revolting and trying to demonstrate not only that they are viewing themselves as subjects of the crown, but that they are willing to do what it takes to achieve the freedom that is being denied to them as they see at the local level. The 19th century is when the era of silences really begins. And I can talk about this more later during Q&A, just the idea of silence and how I use it in this book. But the Emancipation Act of 1833 replaced slavery with an apprenticeship system requiring the newly freed above the age of 6 to labor without pay for their former enslavers for a period of 4 to 6 years. The British government also, as we know, compensated enslavers 20 million pounds, a debt that was not fully repaid until 2015. The enslaved received nothing. Under Queen Victoria, the monarchy, and I think Britain itself, reframed its legacy and its identity as Christian, humanitarian, liberal. This is really the era of liberal empire, of all of these goals where, empire is being projected as something positive, civilizing the world by bringing Christian humanitarian values out into the world. And I think, Prince Albert captures this sentiment when he delivered the opening speech at the meeting of the Society for the Extinction of the Slave Trade in London on June 1st, 1840, before thousands of spectators who primarily attended this meeting to see Prince Albert deliver his first public speech after marrying Queen Victoria. He issued the first royal statement of regret for slavery. Quote, and I'm just going to shorten this quote a bit. I deeply regret that the benevolent and persevering exertions of England to abolish that atrocious traffic in human beings has not as yet led to any satisfactory conclusion. The public, of course, went wild. People were clapping and screaming. Clarkson was, enraptured by this whole moment because it was the first time the sitting consort of the monarch, or sorry, the consort of the sitting monarch had actually embraced the anti-slavery cause. But again, this was a hollow statement. Prince Albert did not apologize, and silence on the centuries of investment and profit that had come before became policy. Essentially, don't talk about it, look forward, focus on positive aspects of British identity and British empire. This strategy of silence persists to this day. Whether it is a Labor government or a conservative government, they have taken the same line that we can't talk about the past, that we need to look forward and be future facing, and that essentially the past is something that we need to move beyond. If we dwell on the past, we're dredging up negative things that actually weaken our institutions. And anyone who questions this narrative or talks about it at all with evidence is dismissed as shameful. And I'm highlighting this review mainly because this review came out right around the time of the former Prince Andrew scandal. And I kept thinking, if anybody is shameful or bringing shame, it is certainly not a historian. I think it's coming from within the palace gates. But calls for a formal apology are intensifying. And obviously, this cannot be done by King Charles as a constitutional monarch on his own. It must be done in consultation with the government. The UN has declared the transatlantic slave trade the quote, gravest crime against humanity, a designation that sharpens the legal and moral stakes of debates over redress, and one that the UK notably abstained from endorsing, in many ways, just continuing the argument I've been making in this book about silence. But the pressure on the king and on the government will continue to grow. The 2026 Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting in Antigua and Barbuda will confront King Charles with direct calls, I believe, for acknowledgement, accountability, and reparatory justice. What happens next rests with the king and with the British government, but also, I think, with the British people, with the public, who need to put pressure on members of parliament so that whether it's Labour or Conservative governments will actually start to take this seriously. Even though, Charles is a constitutional monarch, he has that soft power and influence. And so if he is persuaded that this is critical to his legacy, it's possible there could be some movement on this issue. What I think, though, and having written this book, is that the historical record is unambiguous. Royal involvement in slave trading and slavery was extensive, it was structural, and it was impossible to ignore. Thank you.
Well, that was great. It was very, very interesting. I think that you raised so many different questions. I'm sort of struggling to think which of my many questions I will start off with, because just to give people time to think. I was really struck by, as I said, many things, but your last point about silences is really an interesting one. And since you obviously looked at things like the Royal Archives and other sources, have you got any sense? Do you have any sense of? You just talked about King Charles and uh, his sorrow and all the things that he has said, but do you get a sense of something more personal and um, something that perhaps you'd expect more in that sense?
Mhm. So I think the thing with Charles, I mean, I think there's two aspects of Charles that has led me and I think others to think there might be a possibility here. And one is the fact that he addressed this at all. I actually just a couple of weeks ago met with David Kahn, who I worked with on the Cost of the Crown investigation, and we were just revisiting 3 years on, where are we with King Charles moving on this issue? And he was saying they plan to go back to him in the future and kind of ask him about this. And it's the fact that he responded to the research at all, even if it didn't mean really very much. Elizabeth II, she never said anything. She did not discuss this issue. And he'd also given speeches in Barbados, Rwanda, and other locations expressing sorrow and so forth. And so he seems to be just a little bit more open to acknowledging the fact that this has happened, but he's not there yet in really investing in making this part of his legacy. But I do think, and the second point I'll make about Charles is that because he is an older monarch, because his reign will necessarily be transitional to some extent, he has an opportunity to take this very critical issue, which I think obviously I wouldn't have called my book The Crown of Silence if I didn't think that it was important and that it should be addressed. I think that he could use his influence behind the scenes to help move this forward and not just push it down the line so that William has to deal with it. William, I don't know. In some ways, I think William is unpredictable as far as what he would do. I think we're more likely for Charles potentially to actually respond. But at the same time, he was just in Bermuda, allegedly deepening his understanding again. And I don't know how long you need to deepen your understanding of it. And that's really my question to the king. It's been going, and again, my book is both a synthesis of pre-existing scholarship as well as my own research. And there's so much already out there. I mean, for decades, historians have been talking about transatlantic slave trade. We know about the Royal African Company. K.G. Davies wrote the first book on this, half a century ago. And so it's not a secret, but it hasn't been talked about. It's not being taught. And there's still this sense that, we just need to keep push, kicking the can down the line rather than actually engaging with this issue. And I think the time has come, and I think because there is so much pressure building from the African Union, from CARICOM, from the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Reparations, from the Repair Campaign, and from the Pan-African grassroots activists. I think this is the time. But I do think there's got to be public pressure, because without positive polling suggesting that this is beneficial for the institution, there is not going to be any kind of apology.
Hmm. Interesting. And also, you would have noticed that the king visited the Transatlantic Slave Trade Museum, apparently, in Bermuda. But I'm sure you saw that. Mike, you want to ask your question? Unmute yourself. Yeah.
Yeah, thank Brooke. Thank you so much. It was you didn't miss a beat really in terms of um, going through the whole unspeakable process because when we think about it, this is not some commercial trade. This is the creation of human beings as commodities
Mhm.
and the brutalization. Now, I wanted to just draw attention. You did say, didn't you, earlier on in the presentation, that Cromwell thoroughly endorsed all that had gone before, and then, of course, it passed on to Charles II in the Restoration. I think the point I want to make is this is not just the monarchy. This
Mm.
is the British state.
Yes.
I would characterize it as the crown, but the crown is more than the monarchy. The crown are all the institutions of the British state and of British capitalism. And to be honest, the entire city of London is built on money that was paid as reparations, not to slaves, but to bloody slave traders. And British capitalism would not exist. The British Empire would not have been anything without slavery. And that means we must really keep the pressure on these people,
Right.
both the monarch and all the apologists. You know, I mean, currently we have a Labour Party contest. Any Labour Party candidate who does not utterly condemn and call for talks about reparations should be completely pushed aside. We really need to add the pressure. You've taken a lot of stick for this personally, which proves you're on the right track. So, thank you very much. But let's focus on the crown as a whole and all the tentacles of the British state.
Yeah, I think it's an excellent point, and I think one of the reasons it's worth, because I did think when I started this book project, it was 10 years ago. I was finishing my book on Jamaica, and I had found in correspondence between the Colonial Office and the Jamaica Assembly, depending on which reign, George III, George IV, whoever, references to His Majesty says X, and it was usually marked confidential. And it was not very detailed, but there was a sense there that you're getting a kind of insight into, here is what the sitting monarch thinks about this institution. And then in that book specifically, I was looking at how free people of African and multiple ancestries, how they were viewed. Were they viewed as equal subjects with white subjects? How were they viewed in relation to enslaved people? And so someone like George IV, he argued that they should be extending like an olive branch to the free community so that they didn't have the same explosion of violence like they did in Saint Domingue, resulting in Haiti. And that made me think to myself, why is it that all of these biographies of George III and George IV, there's absolutely no mention of slavery whatsoever. There's no mention of their involvement in these really critical discussions. And we know that the Stuarts played this important role in the Royal African Company. We know about Elizabeth and Hawkins. But what I really wanted to know was, what is the larger story here? What role did they play? Absolutely, it's part of the larger structural state right? Especially once we get to the emergence of the military fiscal state in the 18th century. But one of the key points that I think is worth emphasizing, especially to the public, because there's been such a backlash to my book from the conservative press, this is shame, like basically that this research is all invalid and it's not even real. And then I'm just a dumb American is essentially what I've been said. People have said about me in the British press, which is at first was upsetting. And then I was like, well, it's not surprising. But they went from essentially getting the customs revenue, flowing directly to the royal treasury, to the shift to eventually giving that up in exchange for the civil list. But all of that money is still tied up in empire. It's tied up in slavery. And so whether they are directly investing in slave trading companies like the Royal African Company or the South Sea Company, serving as governors, getting dividends, engaged on a personal level, they are still benefiting institutionally. And so there is that shift over the centuries. And I think that most people, and I'm saying members of the public, don't really understand the extent to which not just the state, but the actual monarchy was involved, because it's easy for people to dismiss the culpability of the state. People do. They'll say, oh, it's just the state. Every state was doing it. It's just the way, all that, what about this? That's the classic argument. But when you take a revered institution like the British monarchy that is tied to national identity, and that some people will defend to the death and point out these very obvious investments and connections, I mean, I would argue that it should at least make them think a little bit about how central slavery is to the fabric of British history and British identity. That is not just something that is dispersed to companies, to the Bank of England, to the church, to Glasgow University or whatever. It is actually fundamental. So that's why I think it's an important story.
I think we agree it's an important story. I don't think there's anybody in the audience who disagrees with that. Let me ask Tony to ask his question. Unmute himself and ask his question.
Yeah, thank you very much, Brooke, for that. The only thing I knew about the involvement of the monarchy in the slave trade or its abolition was the vote of, I think it was a Duke of Clarence in 1808 in the House of Lords against the abolition. I knew very little apart from obviously the role of the Royal African Company. I would just say that the role of slavery in generating the kind of circuit of currency and revenue was crucial in the industrialization of Britain and the role of the empire itself. But when it comes to the monarchy, the monarchy, in a sense, is the humanization of the face of the British state. I mean, that is its crucial ideological role. That you see the British state via Prince Charles, or now Prince Andrew, or ex-Prince Andrew, in that matter, which is partly why I think it's an institution which may not have that much of a longevity, because it is beginning to outlive its use. But I was interested in what you said about the reaction to your book, because it seems to me there are areas of history that historians don't go. I mean, I wrote a book dealing with the collaboration of Zionism with the Nazis, which is a definite no-no, because that's therefore accusing Jews of doing all sorts of things in their own destruction, whereas Zionism is a political current, not Jews as a whole. Likewise, when you're investigating and researching slavery, it's an area that British capitalism and the propaganda and the political institutions really don't want any investigation into, hence the silence. But you mentioned the attitude of Prince Charles, who's an interim monarch in many ways, and then Prince William. I would imagine they have next to no say in anything around this. And this is decided at the very highest levels of the British state in terms of what they will be open to and so on. If you remember was it the bicentenary of William Wilberforce? I mean, if you didn't know anything about the monarchy and the paeans of praise of Queen Elizabeth for Wilberforce, you would have thought that the monarchy was in the advance guard of the abolition movement rather than the rear guard action against it. So thank you very much for this enlightening talk.
I'm going to, before you answer, if you want to answer that, you may want to have some thoughts about. Thank you very much for that, Tony. I'm going to ask Nick. There are quite a lot of questions and comments in the chat, so I think it might be wise to ask Nick and to group a few of these things. But if you could, if you want to comment, Tony, after Nick
Okay.
asks his question.
Thank you, Gad, and very much, Brooke. I attended a meeting of of University of Bristol's Reparative Futures group on Monday, reimagining higher education as accountable partners in repair and transformation, and I would put this session in that context. And at that meeting, Dorbreen Omad, the chair of the Antigua and Barbuda Reparations Support Commission, attended, and he said he's arranging a side event at Chogum in Antigua, and I would expect these issues to be raised quite directly. And I note that Alessandra Cummins is or was in the audience. She's the doyen of museologists in the Caribbean, and I was wondering if she had any further insights. Sorry, Brooke, it's very rude to ask somebody else to comment, but you may also know much more about King Charles's response in and to the museum. But I just wondered if Alessandra had anything, or you had anything more to say. You say he was in the museum, but what is his visceral response? And I suppose I'm speaking today from Bristol, and I have a residual curiosity as to the merchant venturers and the sort of, if there is a history of the British civilian partners in the slave trade, more than that has been going on in the University of London. But I think Chogum is going to be a bit of a crunch point, and the Caribbean colleagues are gearing up for that. And I can send to Steve Cushion perhaps the program for the Bristol conference on Monday, which I think is relevant to this.
And thanks very much, Nick. And Brooke, you might see that there's a comment from Mervyn also about Chogum, a new term for me, but there you are, Chogum 2026. You can see it. Can you see it, Brooke, or shall I read it to you?
Oh, could you read it, please?
Yeah, sure. Mervyn says, I think the reps at Chogum 2026 will be more forceful about demanding an apology and reparations. It's a point that Nick made. Which country would apply the most pressure? How will King Charles react? So it's a follow-on from Nick's point and question.
Yes, I'm gonna go back to the first comment.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because I think it's connected to this. So
yeah.
I just to say, when we were just talking about writing about institutions, when I started working on this project, I guess it was 10 years ago. Yeah, 10 years ago. I knew people that I talked to in the US said they thought it was not a very important topic. And actually, I was rejected for funding I applied for. And one of the peer reviewers said, essentially, who cares about like this topic? And I thought, wow, but I think it's important. So I kept working on it. And then 2020 happened. And at that point, people and institutions started to really respond. And I know that was so short-lived. And then, of course, there's the backlash to that, and there's the culture wars, and they've been happening in the US and the UK and around the world. But there was this brief moment where people acknowledged that the legacies of this history are real, and they are ever present, and they are in multiple places, and that we really should be addressing them. And people were taking action and going to the streets. And then there are all of these very kind of micro level institutions in creating investigations and doing what institutions love to do, creating a committee to assess, blah, 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 and like not much happening, but at least doing something. And of course, the monarchy was not doing anything. And so the mood has shifted. And I do think even in the last 10 years, I mean, we had it was 2015, David Cameron arriving in Jamaica and essentially just dismissing any discussion of this and saying, we're just going to look forward. And this is an attitude that governments love to take, because looking forward it doesn't mean anything. It's a great, talking point. And so in my opinion, the pressure needs to build. And the only way for that to happen is for, your sort of average British person to care about this. And I think that everyone here does care, I would assume, and knows much more about this than the average person. Most people just don't know a lot about history. And I've learned that just from teaching history, whether it's their own history, political history, but particularly history of subjects that they find to be uncomfortable or challenging in some way, especially to their own sense of identity. People tend to resist to engage in that kind of history. And so that is one of the reasons why I wrote this book for a wider audience, because I think that unless we can get people to just care about this history and to see people as, these were millions of people who were caught up in this system, and a lot of people benefited. And to go to your point, I think it was Tony, about the civilians. I know Will Pettigrew is currently working on a big funded project for several years where he has a team of people and they are assessing every single person who invested in the Royal African Company.
Yeah.
Period. And it's an extremely ambitious and important project. And I'm really excited it'll be like, I think, the Legacies of British Slavery UCL project that will be public, it'll be accessible, and we'll be able to see. And I know just from, my own research in those records that you've got people who are like candlestick makers and linen drapers and, people who don't have a lot of money, but they're investing in slavery and slave trading as one of the many ways that they're hoping to diversify their portfolios in the 17th and 18th centuries, because they're not thinking any of this matters in their minds, like the humanity of people who are affected by this. And so that, I think, is a really critical project that's ongoing. And I also think that there's other studies of also even royal connections. And then Grace's work from a couple of weeks ago, looking at the modern understanding of the monarchy in the Caribbean and in the countries that are still part of the realms, like Jamaica, for example. And I think you asked Gad at her talk the question of why, for example, did this come up in Jamaica for so long? Have they still not quite pushed this forward? And I think her answer was right in the sense that there's so many other concerns. And the real question is this just a symbolic move, or will there be substantive improvements to people's lives? And I think because we're all in this global system of cost of living crisis and all the rest of this, these sorts of issues that seem to be operating at a high level of like apology need the idea that is not just abstract or symbolic. It could have real effects, financial effects, investments, challenging things like the impact of climate change, structural underinvestment in countries in the Caribbean that for years and years and years sent all this wealth to Britain. So anyway, I don't know if I answered all the questions, but
yeah, no, that's very good. I would just mention, it might be interesting to people on the call that you talked about the research of Will Pettigrew and his group, and Slavery and Abolition, the journal I'm involved with, will be publishing a kind of a special issue on that very research. Now, there are several, before we come to the people waiting with their hands up, there are several things in the chat, some relevant to this. Maybe I'll link a couple of them. One from Damien, why will the British government, it sort of follows, why will the British government not issue a formal apology as requested by the CARICOM Reparations Commission? Is it a financial aspect? That's one thing. And then Alistair says, you probably all know that the Royal Society was a direct RAC investor from 1660 to 1699, a direct support of UK science. Interesting point. Also, as you will understand, Alistair said, people of Caribbean descent get extremely ticked off when we are told we should be grateful to be here since we haven't contributed historically. Of course, that's a very important point. And Audrey says, I appreciate you, quote unquote, dumb American, for truth telling and campaigning for historical and current justice, human rights for descendants of enslaved Africans, as well as challenging the current British system about slavery and ongoing oppression as its legacy. As an American and a quote unquote outsider, you have a unique voice. So it's an interesting comment.
Mm.
And I think we could go to, I think John was asking before, you had a question before, but I guess you could articulate it, John.
Right, thank you very much. I have a couple of well, one question and two sort of comments to make. The question concerns the French wars of the 18th century, which were launched after the so-called Glorious Revolution, which ended up with the merchant bankers of Edinburgh and the City of London allying with the British Crown, and supplying the Crown with the funds to fight those wars against the French. And I wonder what your take is, Brooke, on the question of whether, well, to what extent those wars were a kind of general geopolitical rivalry focused on rival imperialist powers, and to what extent those wars were specifically about the defense of the respective slave trades and the so-called sugar islands that Britain and France had in the Caribbean, and of course India has to be weighed in there as well. That's my question. Two observations. One is that plantation slavery, which was established particularly by the British, but also the Spanish and the French in the Caribbean, before it was transposed into the southern United States. That was really the early factory system, because it was a factory type system of in that case slave labor with some wage labor, but the mode of production there was early industrial capitalism, and that came, and this leads me to my second point. The great thread that runs through the official narratives about imperialism and the British Empire is that this was somehow autonomous of the state, largely a matter of commercial companies. Well, it wasn't. Brooks touched on this about the extent to which royal chartered companies, both in India and in the Caribbean, were crucial to this process. But the wars and the use of the military by the crown made the crucial differences in actually enabling the slave trade to happen in the first place and to establish it before it was opened up to commercial companies, as Brooke pointed out later on, and in defending it, and extending it happened at the hand of the crown. So that's my contribution. One question and two observations. Thank you.
I'll just say really quickly too, there's a book by Trevor Bernard and John Garrick is called The Plantation Machine, and that is one of the things they're looking at is this early capitalist formation. I mean, Richard Dunn's seminal work also discussed that, essentially how this was in many ways an experimental training ground, but also critical to the emergence of capitalism and the capitalist state. And so there's been so much great work essentially on those connections. And then just a couple other points. If you're interested in thinking more about corporations as well as the role of the crown in connection with corporations, Phil Stern has a great book on it's called like Empire Inc., but it's basically about the corporations that built the British Empire. Great book. And then Nicholas Radburn has a book about the transatlantic slave trade, traders and men, really delving into the day-to-day on the ground nuts and bolts of the transatlantic slave trade. So I think those are all books I'd recommend just based on your comments. The question you asked, My response is that it's intertwined. I mean, I don't think we can separate the geopolitical rivalries from the slave trade and from slavery itself, especially in the 18th century, because when these imperial conflicts occur, they're occurring over both commercial interests, but also territorial interests. And within those overlapping categories, slavery plays a huge role. I mean, especially if you think about ultimately both the British Empire and the French Empire, they are investing so much energy in the Caribbean. They're making so much money off of sugar and slavery and other products derived from coerced labor. Much of what they're thinking about in their calculus is about thinking about territory as ways of, supporting the development of the state and building an empire. And so I'm just thinking a little bit too about, after the 7 Years' War, when the British got the ceded islands, and their first kind of, for maybe a second, like Christopher Brown talks about this, thinking about like, do we need slavery? The answer, of course, is absolutely we need it now. We need to start immediately bringing in more enslaved people. And so that is part of the calculus throughout the 18th century. And then thinking about, too, how do you defend this critical region, which is known as a death trap, the Caribbean theater, for members of the British military? And so George III, in his correspondence, this is something that I think is very clear in his papers. He talks a lot about using enslaved people for military purposes. And I think that is another really important part of the 18th century story. How do you both benefit from the transatlantic slave trade, but then also, even once it's abolished, and they are essentially repurposing liberated Africans and forcing them to join the British military or serve in indentured servitude positions or as apprentices in Sierra Leone, it's always about how can we benefit ourselves through so-called liberation. And so there's a lot of pragmatic imperial calculus in all of this, and it's not I'm not trying to be a total cynic here, but a lot of the language that people want to use now, like let's create a monument to the Royal Navy, it's all about this ideal of, we're liberating people, but what actually happened to those people doesn't seem to matter sometimes in this more superficial context.
Okay, we have a ton of comments in the chat, so I'll go through some of them, so we don't want to miss any of them. But Alessandra does respond and says, she's not aware of the particular response of the king to his visit to the museum. Nothing useful to add to your observation, Brooke. What we are seeing, she says, is a much greater willingness amongst museums to tell clearer stories about the involvement of the royal family in all this. And Alistair comes back with talking about the article by Jenny Bulstrode, who also gave us a paper a while ago, about Jamaican slave iron workers whose innovation played a key role in volume production of high quality iron and steel production. And she got death threats, he says, as a result of her article in The Guardian. Ruth says, thank you so much. And sorry to hear that you've been targeted. And it should be, good line, it should be, your work should be in every school and household. Absolutely. Mary Chamberlain says, thank you, Brooke. This is such an important topic. We articulate brilliantly how to put pressure on the government is perhaps more difficult to assess because of the widespread ignorance of the issue and the resistance to the British government of whichever hue. She was a member of the government Caribbean Advisory Group under the Blair government in the late 1990s. They raised the issue of apology reparations then, that's of course 30 years ago, were given short shrift with no explanation. And she worries that the same response will be given now. And Nick comes back. One issue that remains is the questionable relevance of the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting, but it's important for small island developing states. So this year's CHOGM is a key opportunity for reparations discussion, but an apology would, as I understand it, be an admission of liability, hence unlikely. And there's more, but maybe you want to respond to some of those things, or maybe those are just comments and you're happy just to have some more questions.
I'll respond after Kate gets to ask her question since she's had her hand up so long.
Okay.
Oh, thank you so much. Brilliant talk, of course. And I guess just first to acknowledge how absolutely insidious this whole British press reaction is, as people have said in the comments. You know, we've had other speakers in this series who have likewise been the subject of hit pieces and worse in the British press. So it's a very organized and well-funded thing. The project that I'm on The Visible Crown, the PI of that was also subject of a hit piece in the Daily Telegraph, and on and on and on it goes. But anyway, that's that. The question I had was about how other European monarchies are responding to their own history. So I'm aware of a project in the Netherlands where the King of the Netherlands, as I understand it, put up his own money to fund like a 5-year multi-researcher project. Gertrude Cindy, or Gert, who Cindy is the head of that, and I was speaking to him about that a couple of years ago. So, and I think it was coming to an end at that point. I'm not aware, I haven't followed up on what's come out of that, if it's another kind of mechanism for processing this history in a kind of palatable way. What I understood from Gert was that, the king had said they'd only agreed to take this, the researchers had only agreed to take this money on the condition that they were allowed to work independently. There'd be no, and the king apparently said yes, yes, yes. So I don't know if you've got any insights into how other European monarchies have been dealing with this, and whether, no, sorry, just whether monarchy to monarchy pressure on each other could be one mechanism for pressurizing Charles, is get his other king friends to to tell him to fall in line.
So a year ago, I was invited actually to the Netherlands by Gert to attend a symposium, and it was on European monarchies, colonialism, and slavery. And so it was great because there were multiple scholars there talking about, we had someone discussing Belgium, Portuguese, France, Britain, etc. And so there's a lot of us together. Everyone discussed in also different contexts. The Dutch, some had been involved for centuries, some were only involved for very brief periods. It all depended on, some monarchies still exist, some don't. So we talked about all of that. But in answer to your question, that all that research has now been compiled into an edited volume about all the different European monarchies, and it is going to be published open access and presented to the king this fall in October. And actually, I just got the proofs for my essay a couple of weeks ago. And so, yeah, it's going to be out, and I think it's going to be really revealing, just because what we were asked to do, and it was actually honestly really hard because it was a very short essay of like 6,000 words. We had to talk about all of his history, and then like, what is the current status? What's happening? And so in the Netherlands, it's a kind of a rare case in the sense that the king has created an independent commission, put money towards this, and this money was used to host this symposium, put together this volume, make it open access. So he's doing, I think, material things to actually encourage research on this, encourage public access to information, making I also know that they are working with the archives and collections in the Netherlands to make them more publicly available so basically transparency is part of this, as well as, he's made an apology. Will it be sufficient? Is it going to go far enough? I think that is always up for debate, and it's not up to me in any way to kind of judge that. But I think that it is some progress compared to what's happening in the UK, which is nothing. And I mean, Gad was actually at my book. I had a talk with Belle Ribeiro Addy, who is the head of the all-party parliamentary group for reparations, in January at Waterstones, and I asked her essentially, in terms of your participation in this group, what do people most want to see? And she said an official acknowledgement, because that is the first step. And one of the people in the thread said, why haven't they done this? And your answer is exactly right. It's the financial liability. It's when you apologize, there's a legal case. Because part of the argument that's being made, even in response to the UN vote, is about the fact, or the claim, that none of this was illegal. Slavery was legal, transatlantic slave trade. So they're trying to use legality as a way of getting out of this whole conversation around reparations. So people involved in the reparations movement are turning to the law, and also trying to use that as a counter argument. So there's a lot of different things in play right now. And I think especially the government, knows that if they apologize, then there will be a financial, aspect to this, and that it could be deeply unpopular among the public because there's only, X percentage of people in Britain who support an apology and reparations. And so that, again, to me, suggests that the public needs to care about this issue in order to put pressure on politicians who don't do things if they don't think it's going to benefit their careers in the long run. Same with Charles. He's not going to do something unless he thinks it's going to benefit the institution and its survival.
Okay. We have worked you pretty hard, and there are quite a few comments remaining in the chat, and there's one final question from Marcia. So what I will do is go through the chat and see if there's anything specific, and then ask Marcia to conclude. Edgar reinforces it should be through an economic lens. I think we've agreed with that. You've just talked about that. And Alistair comes back about talking about the period of 1781 to 91 as peak slave production, representing 15% of UK imports. Well, the same as, interestingly, Alistair says, from the North Sea oil. And Phil saying how dreadful the teaching of history in this country. No one's trying to drag up the past, quoting Starmer and others, because they've never been taught about this history in school. And much of it should have been learned there, of course. The Crown, the state, not the monarchy, in 2026, is no more interested in exposing this history of the Crown, this history, than the Crown was in previous eras. Dutch monarchy have done a bit. And considering European monarchies as a policy community could yield insights, Nick suggests. The Belgian, and Mike says, of course, the Belgian monarchy carries a particular burden of shame, absolutely. And Tony says, perhaps we should get together a petition, possibly on the Parliament site, calling for the British monarchy and Charles to fund similar research. That's a hope, but, is that likely? I'd be interested to see this document as British monarchy intermarried with other persons of Europe. There must be more records. So that's a lot of stuff in the chat. And you might, if you have any comments, you might hold them for a second, and I'll ask Marcia to ask her question briefly, since we're certainly running out of time. Marcia?
Hello, Brooke. Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. And I would say that I'm a great supporter of your work. I have your book right here with me. And I had it a couple of months, and I rely on it for that early history. But one of the things I need to share with you is, and I wondered if you thought about it when you were conducting your research and writing, and examining the role of Barbados in the 1650s, 1640s period. My theory, when I examine the coastline of the island, and I see that the forts right into the 1700s, when, as you mentioned, Queen Anne was very much involved with the South Sea Company, etc. You may have noticed, and I wondered if you have a view on it, that there were 36 forts along the coastline of Barbados. Should I say facilities, that some of them were named, and in the naming, the word fort is used. And I wondered if you examined that from the north right down to the south along the west coast. And you would probably have noticed there was Chateau de Anne, which became Anne Fort at some point, but it was initially Chateau. There was Charles Fort, there's Orange Fort, there's Willoughby Fort, etc., etc. And when I looked at these forts and I read your information of the 1600s into the early 1700s, it reaffirmed to me that my theory may not be incorrect, that these facilities were actually facilities that received Africans in the transatlantic trade, and that Barbados as an island was identified as the ideal Western location for these facilities. And this would be identified by the most wealthy persons, and obviously by Charles and by Anne and so forth. And that in saying that, I recognize that your work is extremely important, and it is extremely important if you also place it against what might have been the need of the monarchy where Barbados was concerned, and how appropriate it was at the time for Barbados to move to its own constitution in 1652. And when you mirror that against what your history, your book reveals, and then when Barbados moves to developing the 1661 slave trade, when you examine it against what you have revealed, I think we all have to make a reappraisal of Barbados just as a sugar, initially tobacco, cotton, ginger, sugarcane, sugar, rum, molasses island, and begin to see it in the light of a very important transatlantic warehousing, refresher island. And perhaps with Anne having the Asiento and other happenings even before that and subsequent to that, yes, some Africans were needed to develop. That was a no-brainer to develop the land, but the location of the island physically and the fact that many countries that colonized the West had vessels that were solely positioned in the West and moved between Barbados.
I still can't find the point on here where you raise your hand. It's just
South, Central, and North America. I think your book speaks into that beautifully, and that opens up a whole realm of research. And I wondered if you, in compiling your book, if that thought had crossed your mind, as it has been on mine now for at least 2 years.
Yeah, thanks for your question. In my longer version of the presentation, I actually talk about how I talk a little bit more about Barbados as the first port of call for the majority of shipments of enslaved people, but also from the Asiento perspective, Barbados and Jamaica are the two sites where they have a South Sea Company factors stationed, essentially, as you said, to receive shipments of people. And they called it refreshment in the archival materials, but what they really mean is to take the survivors and put them in these holding pens until they're ready to be shipped on to Spanish.
Yes, bro.
Yes. And also there is a good book about Barbados' significance in this much larger scale by called Final Passages by Greg O'Malley. And in that book, he talks at length about the significance of Barbados strategically because of its position and because it is the first port of call, not just in the 17th century, but into the 18th century. And then the other note that you made, which I think is also significant, and I thinking about this while I was writing the book, and it was one of those things too, where I ended up just having to finish this book, but I know there's so many more aspects of this story that are out there, right? So there's so many royal names everywhere. And actually one of my future projects, I want to be thinking a bit more about like the built environment and material culture and the legacies of that. And in some places, things have been renamed. They've taken the names away, but in some places they're still there, or there's statues and no one is protesting them. Or even if you go to certain Commonwealth realms like New Zealand, Australia, there might be a Queen Victoria statue and, no one is protesting around that statue. It's just there. And so, but in other places, maybe a statue's been taken down or a square has been renamed. And so the naming in and of itself is an important part of this story as well. I mean, I live in Virginia where there are so many traces of monarchy here, counties, buildings, city, I mean, and also the Confederacy. And so whether we're thinking about slaveholders in the 19th century, Americans, or members of the royal family, or members of the aristocracy who have counties named after them, all of them are benefiting off of coerced labor in some way, including the coerced labor of indigenous people, many of whom were also shipped to Barbados in the 17th century. And I do talk some about that in the book. But there's some new work coming out on indigenous slavery as well in the Caribbean in the next year or two, which I think will be really interesting to kind of extend this larger focus, because my focus was primarily on African slavery. But one other question I had was about the interest versus the there's no more interest now than there was in the past. And I absolutely agree with whoever made that comment. I think, though, the key is not about the interest of the institution. We know that they are self-interested. Nobody would have ever done anything about the Epstein situation unless there was pressure. And so what has changed is the context, it's the awareness, it's all of these different stakeholders coming together and working to put pressure on local governments, regional governments, and the British state and the monarchy. And so I think that has to continue, and it can't just be a blip, because I think that's part of the conversation I was having with David Kahn recently was about, what's happening in the next year that the Guardian could maybe use as a catalyst for these kinds of questions. And it's always like there has to be something happening in the news to peg this issue to. And so people need to basically make news like we did in 2020 so that this becomes an issue that that has to be covered in the media, that has to be discussed. And so I think that's part of the story, is that it's about building momentum and pressure. It's not about them and their interests, because they will be forced to, kicking and screaming, actually do something about this, just like they were in the era of abolition.
I think that this could run and run. We can't run and run. There are a couple of final comments in the chat which are interesting about the Drax family, about Cromwell and shipping Irish people, and Mervyn comes back with another comment about the relevant countries that were responsible for the enslavement were governing the island should at least provide necessary finance, etc., and reparations, of course. And there are a lot of comments about thanking very much for this very wonderful talk. And I would reinforce that. I think this has been great, and I think the level of interest, it doesn't surprise me in the slightest that this has generated this kind of interest and comment and questions. And you've done very well in responding to all of them. So thank you very much for such an interesting and lively seminar. I look forward to our sharing